Sitting with me is Dr. Herbert Marcuse, a professor of politics and philosophy at Brandeis University, and the author of the recent book entitled One-Dimensional Man, published by Beacon Press, and also John Simon, who's an editor at a New York publishing house. And we're going to be discussing Dr. Marcuse's book, One-Dimensional Man. And this is a book, as I understand it, which is about the United States, and its general thesis is that in certain significant ways we have reached a situation, or are reaching a situation, which is extremely close to a totalitarian society. And I think we'll begin by discussing what precisely we mean by this. And I want to quote from Dr. Marcuse's book. You write, "By virtue of the way it has organized its technological base, contemporary industrial society tends to be totalitarian. For totalitarian is not only a terroristic political coordination of society, but also a non-terroristic economic technical coordination, which operates through the manipulation of needs by vested interests. It thus precludes the emergence of an effective opposition against the whole. Not only a specific form of government or party rule makes for totalitarianism, but also a specific system of production and distribution, which may well be compatible with a pluralism of parties, newspapers, countervailing powers, etc." And I wonder if you'd begin by telling us precisely what you mean, in this sense, by totalitarian.
Yes, may I begin by qualifying a little what you said? Actually, my book does not deal with the United States. It deals, as the quotation shows, with certain tendencies, not more, certain tendencies which I think are observable in the most advanced areas of industrial civilization. The most advanced area of industrial civilization, of course, is the United States today, but even in the United States, the tendencies to which I point are prevailing, if they are prevailing at all or not simply beginning to show themselves, only in certain advanced areas, meaning, as is well known, that there are still vast regions of underdevelopment, of poverty, even in the United States. Now, by a totalitarian, I use the term fully aware that this might violate certain taboos. We are used to apply the term totalitarian only to, well, first the fascist and Nazi society, then the communist society. That is to say, we are used to apply the term totalitarian to societies under a more or less terroristic dictatorship, with a one-party system, with the more or less terroristic elimination of all opposition. I believe that such a confined, restricted use of the term totalitarian is itself ideological, because it may serve to cover up the fact, at least in my opinion, a fact that totalitarian tendencies are beginning to show even in societies which are still democratic, which preserve the democratic process and institutions, which have several parties, which may even have countervailing forces. By totalitarian, I mean the constellation or situation in which the private as well as public existence of man, of the individual, is controlled, is exposed to standardized, required ways of behavior, standardized imposed values, standardized imposed needs. This can be done by a private as well as by a public bureaucracy. It can be done via the perfectly democratic media of mass communication and so on. It is in a way a consequence, as the quote shows, of technical progress, which implies mass production and mass distribution. Mass production and mass distribution in turn require a considerable degree of standardization, a considerable degree of the submission of the individual to pre-given and superimposed values, ideas, aspirations, goals, and so on.
Is this a necessary condition of this particular productive capacity and system?
Well, the term necessary applied to history is a very questionable term. We can say in a strict sense, if you mean it in the sense of a physical law, nothing is necessary in history. I do think it is the byproduct, at present inevitable byproduct, of the way in which technical progress actually has taken place in industrial society.
And this this argument applies as well to societies that are organized on a more or less individualistic basis, as well as those that are collectivistically organized. That is, the same critique applies as well to the Soviet Union or to the countries in the Soviet bloc as it does to the United States. You would argue that.
I would say it applies in the sense that similar tendencies are, I think, observable there. Of course, with vast differences based on the entirely different foundation and organization of the entire economy. But inasmuch as the Soviet Union will very soon join the most advanced areas of industrial civilization, I think the two systems will become more or less assimilated.
I think we ought to make clear at this point, because you do make it clear in your book that you do see differences between the Soviet Union and the United States.
Vast differences.
Yes, and maybe you ought to ground away.
Well, the obvious difference is that the society, as I just mentioned, is organized on an essentially different basis. The collective ownership and control of the means of production, regardless of whether or not you consider it as already socialist or not socialist at all, is sufficiently different from a society organized on the basis of private control and ownership of the means of production to make for decisive differences in the tendencies of development.
There is also, is there not a difference in the legal basis of control by the state? Or is there?
What do you mean by legal basis?
Well, we are to some extent individuals, and their own participation and their own ability to dissent are protected more in the American system than in the Soviet system.
They are certainly more protected. They are even institutionalized in the American system. They are not institutionalized in the Soviet system. But precisely here I have a great fear that this institutionalization of civil rights, and especially the right and liberty to dissent, is gradually corroded, is reduced, not by terror, not by a conspiracy, but simply by the mechanisms of technical growth within the framework of the established institutions.
Before we get into a discussion of that particular area, and since we're attempting to define your use of totalitarian, which I take it is quite different than, say, Carl Friedrich's use of the word.
Oh, yes.
I wanted to ask about the applicability of the concept to the non-advanced sectors of the world, where particularly those countries that are now labeled socialist and are going in for extensive planning and use of many of the kinds of controls that you suggest exist in advanced industrial society, Ghana, Cuba, Algeria, for example. Does the definition begin to apply in these countries as well, or in these areas?
That is one of the most difficult questions to raise and to answer. On the one hand, I would say, and it may sound paradoxical, although I don't think it is paradoxical, that these countries, precisely because they are not yet at the advanced stage of industrialization, where they have to buy all the negative features of this kind of industrialization, that these countries have a better chance of proceeding differently, that these countries have a better chance of building from scrap a freer and a more human society. But there are other impediments here. namely that the vast majority of these countries is too weak in resources, intellectual as well as material, to do it by themselves. They are by themselves, as far as I can see, again, with some exceptions, incapable of accumulating the funds, capital funds that would be necessary for development, and therefore will have to rely on outside help, which can come only from the East or from the West. And I am apprehensive lest this dependence on outside help would not almost inevitably these countries lead along the path at present gone either by the East or by the West. So that the idea of a third force is still a more or less a utopian idea.
Mm-hmm. One more question in this general area. Isaac Deutscher, in his book The Great Contest, where he dealt with issues of the Cold War, which are not really central to this discussion, suggested that the potential, the ultimate potential for freedom in the organization of the in this sense of the totalitarian Soviet society was far greater than existed in any area of the West because of the way in which the controls were applied and were used. Would you agree with this, the formulation of Mr. Deutscher's?
I agree up to a very definite point. If Deutscher wants to say that the establishment of a planned society does not have to cope with the vested interests which otherwise stand in the way of a utilization of all available resources for the satisfaction of vital needs wherever they are still not satisfied, rather than proceeding through waste and planned obsolescence. If he wants to say that, I agree entirely. Such a centrally planned society in which the counteracting vested interests are indeed eliminated would have a far greater potential to develop humanity, let's say in short, than another society. But here I think we have to place the development of Soviet society in the actual context of peaceful or rather hostile coexistence, which means that the Soviet Union too at present sees itself committed to divert a vast section of its resources, of the social wealth, to armament production, and thereby has to impose sacrifices which otherwise would not have to be imposed.
Mm-hmm. I think maybe something we ought to explore a little bit at this point is to go back to this question of totalitarian. And the reason I come back to it, I think, is because it is an extremely provocative word to be used in the context of modern American life. One of the things you talk about in this regard is the range and the nature of choice available in this society. And one should say, I suppose, in the first place, that it seems that there is a great range of choice to some extent. We, after all, choose our political candidates and our political leaders from a range of candidates. We choose what particular job we want to go to, what educational institution we want to go to.
Do we really choose the candidates, or are they not chosen for us? Do I and you or whoever it is choose a candidate which is actually running, or does somebody else, does a machine, or I don't know what do it?
Well, there is a choice, at least, between different candidates with different points of view. And Mr. Barry Goldwater has a different orientation, I believe, than our President Johnson.
Yes, certainly.
Are these real choices?
They are real choices wherever you have real difference of opinion. Now I'm again gradually suspicious of speeches and platforms and programs made before the elections. They are usually hardly in any relation to what happened after the election. If you have still real difference of opinion, I would say you indeed have a choice and you have freedom of choice. But that is precisely what I start to doubt. The mere fact that we have two parties does not yet by itself mean that these parties differ in the essential attitudes and opinions. There may well be differences within one and the same accepted and established framework, in which case both parties would compete in preserving the existing framework rather than working for alternatives if there are any alternatives.
One of the traditional areas of dissent, aside from the political arena, of course, have been the academies and the existence of an intellectual community which at times historically has seen things differently than the current establishment of a society. Do you see in the academies the existence of a real dissent and a real opposition of alternatives?
By academies you mean universities, colleges, and so on?
Yes.
Well, I would say, since this is precisely the field where I do have experience, that is perhaps today the area which is still the freest of all. My long experience with students has shown me that these students, at least when they enter the university, are still entirely open-minded, that they think by themselves, that they preserve their open mind, that they are highly critical, and that they really talk, at least if they know that they can talk. It depends on with whom they talk. Gradually, however, the dire need makes itself felt to look for a job. They know perfectly well that if they go on like that, if they continue to have really dissenting opinions and not only slight differences in opinion, it may be very difficult for them to find a job, and that sooner or later they have to adopt modes of behavior in which at least they conceal the dissent or express it in such a way that it does not cause a scandal, and I certainly don't blame them for doing it.
But is this really sufficient to explain a lack of dissent? There have been scholars and intellectuals who have been able to take a dissenting position in terms of their publication, and one thinks of individuals like C. Wright Mills, and in a much different sense, and in a much more popular sense, Vance Packard. How would you account for the existence of these people, and how would you account for the fact that there are not more like them?
I would not say, and I don't think I did say, that we have no dissent. What I did say and what I mean and what I would like to repeat is we have a considerable amount of dissent. We can afford this dissent because it remains completely and entirely ineffective. We can afford to have C. Wright Mills. We can afford to let Vance Packard say things which formerly would have been very meticulously concealed, because our society is so strong, so cohesive, so powerful, that these revelations don't do it any harm. And in a sense, that is good. But in another sense, and perhaps in a deeper sense, this is very bad.
John?
Yes, on the question, I have two questions really, but first I'd like to ask you about the particular phenomenon of Vance Packard. He sells in the hundreds of thousands of copies and is widely read, and yet seems to have no real influence in the society. It's the kind of thing that just slips off the surface. It makes perhaps a momentary impression and disappears. And of course, in the case of C. Wright Mills, Professor Mills wrote a book called Listen Yankee, which sold over 400,000 copies and was read, as I noticed, by secretaries riding on the subway, and yet again made no impression. The society seems not only confident to allow dissenters to exist, but to allow them to be fairly widely disseminated in some cases. How would you want to comment on the phenomenon of the lack of impression of these people and the processes and devices by which this is accomplished?
Yes, because I believe there is another impression which overrides and weakens and in the last analysis destroys it makes impotent the impressions left by these books. That is the impression that, never mind, after all, this society functions beautifully and efficiently. It has succeeded in vastly increasing the standard of living, in distributing its benefits over larger section of the former underprivileged population. We still have these large areas of poverty, but nothing proves that these areas cannot sooner or later also be taken care of. So what these people reveal and indict are simply byproducts of the famous affluent society, byproducts which at present we have to cope with, but which are not really in any way serious and dangerous.
The event in the recent past that seems most to bear this out, it seems to me, it was the assassination of the president, where there existed at least the opportunity for an act and the consequences of the act to have a deep impress on the American people, and yet it was as if the display of that 4 days was like another television drama.
Like a television show, exactly.
Which
and after 4 days it was completely incorporated into the daily business of life. There was a new president, things are going on.
Yes, well, what I wanted to ask you was to perhaps comment a little bit more on the specific techniques and methods, since the mass communications industry plays such a large role in this whole process. Would you care to comment on that?
Yes, but again, I don't want to make the impression that I consider the whole thing as a conspiracy on the part of the media of mass communication. We have a conspiratorial aspect there too. I only remind you of the famous self-censorship, which is exercised by the press, by the movie industry, whatever it is. A self-censorship far more effective and far more efficient than any state instituted censor. That is not the point. I think that all these developments have a very rational basis, namely precisely that our system works. And because it works, because it is so productive, because it distributes such benefits, we repress the price which we pay for this affluence, a word which, by the way, I would only use in quotation marks. It is this repression, it is the repression of the price, the cost, the sacrifices that are involved, which is actually what bothers me.
Well, this raises a question, because thus far we've been speaking about such, and here again I use quotation marks, intangibles, end quotation marks, as the range of choice available not being truly a meaningful choice, and the social sciences and the academic institutions, while tolerating some dissent, nonetheless not really participating in the development and movement of the society. What's wrong with the society as it now stands? Is there a need to change the society? I mean, after all, we haven't we, if we haven't achieved utopia, aren't we getting close to reaching a utopia, at least in terms of the production of material goods and physical comfort?
Well, that question leads to the what I consider the core of the whole problem. I once raised in a rather large course of mine at the university the question, it was a kind of examination question. I asked the students, I want you to tell me what is wrong with the society. I never got an answer. Nobody could or nobody dared to tell me what is actually wrong with the society.
Did the students flunk the course?
No, they didn't. Because again, I completely understand why they didn't either want to tell me or didn't know. What is wrong with it is, and here I have to become a little philosophical, and even a little utopian. For me, the word utopia makes no sense because, in my view, there is nothing today which could be reasonably called utopia. Mankind has reached a stage where, if it wanted to, it could actually, within a relatively short time, translate into reality even the most utopian idea. So the term utopia, again, is a subterfuge. What is wrong with this society is that it retains, that it perpetuates the struggle for existence, toil, frustration, waste, although all the intellectual and material capabilities are there to pacify the struggle for existence, in the international arena as well as within the nation, and for the private individual. And by pacification of the struggle for existence, I mean something, I think, very concrete. I expressed it in the phrase, and I think your listeners will know what I'm talking about, the abolition of alienated labor. We have reached a stage where industrial civilization really could reduce working time to such an extent that the traditional proportion between working time and free time is reversed. That free time becomes full time and working time marginal time. This would involve a complete transvaluation of values. It would cancel some of the most cherished taboos of the established civilization. For example, the need for earning a living instead of making life an end in itself and not a means to attain an end which is either never attained or only in an age where you cannot enjoy it anymore. This, I think, today is the alternative. And this alternative is systematically, again, not in terms of a conspiracy, but objectively, prevented by the way in which we continue the established direction of progress.
Well, there are 2 points there, and would it be fair to rephrase the first part of that to say, in a kind of shorthand sense, that while we have the possibility of living within a society of plenty, the society is still organized as if it were a society of scarcity?
No, for one very simple reason. You don't need plenty in order to have a humane society. I would even go so far, and there again you will have to protect me, I would even go so far as to say that one of the crimes of our present era is that we have too much in a situation where the vast majority of the people of the earth have too little. So it is not a question of plenty.
Well, let me change it to then a comparison between enough. We have the potential of developing a society based on enough, and we're still living as if it's a society based on scarcity.
That's correct.
The second part of that, the second part of what you just said...
Chris, can I interrupt you for a minute? On the question of enough and scarcity, isn't it also true that the concept of scarcity doesn't apply because the need to waste is so paramount in this society?
Certainly. The need to waste is paramount. The need to waste is absolutely essential because it is a need for waste which in turn perpetuates the need for earning a living, the need for work, for doing work which in fact technically is already superfluous.
Can we make you into a bit of a visionary and ask you to discuss what the nature of a society where the concepts of work and leisure break down will be like, or what you would expect?
You cannot, because we are at present, I think, utterly incapable to draft anything like a blueprint for such a society. It is so easily ridiculed because we always assume that the individuals, as they have been preconditioned, as they are now, will suddenly be placed in a situation in which they don't have to work for a living anymore, in which they don't have to earn a living anymore, in which most of their time is free time. And it is then very easy to say, and I agree, that would be a catastrophe. And indeed, perhaps the greatest catastrophe of civilization. It would be complete chaos. It would be a nightmare. We cannot envision such a society because it is so radically different from what we have now that any such vision would really be, in a way, irresponsible.
Well, let me try this comment then, that we have the potential of developing, however it might be organized and set up, something approaching what has traditionally been considered a utopian kind of existence.
Yes.
Now then, you then go on in the second part of your earlier statement to say that you see the society, however, moving and with tendencies which not only are not leading toward the establishment or existence of this kind of society, but are actually leading in the other direction. And this is what I wanted to question you on, because hasn't it always been true that the technological abilities of society have been ahead of the social abilities of the societies to utilize these techniques? Isn't this simply a question of cultural lag? Why isn't it that we aren't, in fact, slowly evolving a framework whereby we can use these technological developments to create a healthy, humane society?
Because in my view, it is not simply a time lag or a cultural lag in any other sense. The decisive difference here is that what is involved is not simply a better utilization and a better development of the available technical resources, but what I called a radical redirection of technical progress itself. And such a radical redirection of technical progress, namely first to the satisfaction of vital needs and to pacification, such a radical redirection is, in my view, not possible within the established framework, but would involve a sweeping change in our institutions, which were still institutions adopted to scarcity and not to what we potentially have now.
Why can't this change be made? Let me also quote at this point something from your introduction that may or may not throw light on what I'm getting at. You said here that the way in which a society organizes the life of its members involves an initial choice between historical alternatives which are determined by the inherited level of the material and intellectual culture. The choice itself results from the play of the dominant interests. It anticipates specific modes, transforming and utilizing man and nature, and rejects other modes, etc. The word I was looking at there was the word choice.
If I would not believe that such a redirection is historically possible, I wouldn't have written my book. As far as the choice is concerned, there indeed I am very pessimistic, because the choice would require, among other things, men who live in the dire need for such a change. This dire need is, as I pointed out today, effectively repressed. It would furthermore require that these people who live in need of such a change actually have the power to bring the change about. This too at present is not the case.
Does anybody benefit from this society as it's currently set up?
Yes, most certainly. I think if not the majority, at least a large segment of the population benefits for it, and that is precisely why it is so serious, why it is so painful to criticize the society. But I believe that more is at stake than these benefits. Well, to use a cliché, although I hate it, I seriously believe that the chances of a human and humane existence for all, without war, are at stake, and in view of these chances, I think one has to criticize even a society which is more beneficial to more people perhaps than any preceding society in history.
But in a sense, it also doesn't it? Although it may benefit some members more than others, it also does. Well, it also wraps up those who benefit to some extent, and doesn't allow for their own full development as human beings. And I think this is what you meant when you spoke at one point. The world tends to become the stuff of total administration, which absorbs even the administrators.
Yes, it absorbs not only the administrators, it suffocates not only the need for a redirection of progress, but it even does its best to arrest the development of concepts and modes of thoughts which could define, could sketch alternatives of the development, not only quantitative changes, but qualitative changes. That is why I have the critique of present-day positivism and empiricism, which I consider a pseudo-empiricism, a false empiricism, because it orients itself on a restricted and manipulated experience.
I just want to push you on a second, and then John, I know, has a question. Previously, it might be said that a society that benefited certain groups in the society rather than others had to be maintained in the eyes of those who benefited, because it was simply impossible technologically for the group that benefited to maintain its particular benefits in an totally egalitarian system. But now we have a society where that is no longer impossible, where in fact those who benefit need not give up very much in order to share their benefits with the others in the society through the advent of automation and cybernetics and these techniques. Also, in the current situation, isn't it true that those who benefit could benefit more in a different social situation? Why then isn't it possible that traditional leadership groups themselves could at this point, under these conditions, make the transition to a different kind of society?
Because it would be, as far as I know, the first case in history in which a invested and entrenched leadership, or a ruling class, if you wish, has voluntarily abdicated. The chances that they may not benefit the way they benefit now, the risk of serious disruptions and even of a catastrophe involved is such that they will understandably not be willing to voluntarily to institute such changes.
Eric Fromm in The Sane Society, I think, argues that there are certain strong reasons why even those involved in leadership do not benefit as greatly from this society as they could from a different kind of society. Couldn't this act as a sufficient stimulation to an aware leadership to make a transition?
No, as far as I remember, he means by that simply, well, for example, that even the rich are not happy. Now, in the first place, I never took that very seriously, and I don't believe that the unhappiness of the rich should really be a matter of serious concern. And in the second place, I don't think you can interpret this reluctance primarily in psychological terms. What is involved, after all, is indeed, to speak perfectly frankly, a fundamental change in the established political and economic institutions. As already indicated, for example, a planned economy, a really planned economy, with priorities set on the satisfaction of needs, is not compatible with the present private control of the economy.
Would these individuals, one final question on this point, would this leadership be giving up much more than simply a question of status and leadership? Would they be giving up any material conditions of livelihood?
Again, looking back at history, it is at least possible, if not probable, that they would indeed have to give up much of what they have now, that others would move in. who want to do it in a different way. That I would indeed say.
John?
Yes. You describe a contradiction or an antagonism between the need for change, and I assume that this is a kind of objective need that exists without the wishes or feelings of anyone, and the repression of the expression of the need for this change. Now, do you foresee in any sense, perhaps even in the classical Marxian sense, a breakdown based on this kind of contradiction in the system that will force some kind of change, perhaps not the one that we want, or the one that you foresee?
The possibilities of such a breakdown are such that I think not even the most rabid Marxist would wish them. For example, I could imagine that a nuclear war, or even short of a nuclear war, a large-scale international war, would release forces that may make for such a redirection of progress, but who is insane enough to wish that?
Mm-hmm. You don't see it, see such a breakdown stemming from less cataclysmic factors like stagnation within the economy, or some kind of breakdown in the arrangement and organization of our social and sexual mores, for example. There's a group among writers, for example, Norman Mailer in particular, who talks about the sexual revolution. Do these factors have any significance to your way of thinking?
Could we expand sexual to kind of a whole moral crisis?
Yes, well, that's what...
I think that is one of the disastrous and almost criminal applications of the term revolution. We have now a revolution. If the Coca-Cola company brings out a new bottle, it is a revolution in bottling. We have a revolution in deodorant. We have a revolution in everything. Only we don't have a revolution where in the only field in which the term revolution makes any sense. I don't see a sexual revolution at all. On the contrary, as I try to point out in my book, I see a very nice, very welcome and very pleasurable and pleasant adaptation of sexual mores to the requirements of the affluent society, which you simply cannot do anymore with Victorian morality. That has nothing to do with a revolution.
To follow up on that, this very pleasant development in our sexual and social mores that you talk about seems to develop somewhat in opposition to the non-terroristic totalitarianizing of the society. Yes or no?
I doubt even that.
Mm-hmm.
I doubt even that, because the more sexual freedom people have within the establishment and without being punished by the establishment, the easier they are to guide, the easier they are to manipulate. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I will be the last to condemn this liberation in sexual morality.
Let me ask you a question historically. Maybe you can't answer, maybe you don't want to or can't answer this, but and I thought of this when John brought up the question of the, well, I won't use the word revolution, the changes in our sexual mores. In addition, we find certain tendencies taking place in art and literature, and also in the use of drugs, which seem possibly to be interrelated here. There's been a great deal of talk about another revolution, the drug revolution, the use of consciousness-expanding drugs, where with Mr. Timothy Leary and IFIF, International Federation for Internal Freedom. And similarly, artists, in perhaps analogous way, in abstract expressionism and tendencies like this, have developed an art form which becomes, at least to me, so solipsistic that it almost ceases to have any relevance other than for oneself. Are there historical parallels in these kinds of developments and other social tendencies and developments? And one hears a great deal. I was thinking of the decline of the Roman Empire, for example, as being a time of libertinism and a concern with extreme individuality.
The period following the French Revolution.
Yes.
Well, the period following the French Revolution, the period of the Directoire, is slightly different, because there indeed you had a considerable degree of genuine freedom in these things, provided you belonged to the jeunesse dorée. The others didn't have it and never did have it. As far as the drugs are concerned, this is very close to my heart, because again, unfortunately, in the universities, we are very much concerned with it. In this respect, I'm a terrible reactionary, as in many other respects. I think that drugs are reprehensible, and that the only case in which they are to be welcomed is in case of pain, of insufferable physical pain. In all other cases, they cannot possibly do what these people pretend they do, especially not in art, literature, development of consciousness. All these, if anything, are acts of human freedom. And if they are not the development and attainment of human freedom, they will invariably accomplish the opposite of what they are supposed to be to accomplish, namely some kind of illusory happiness, illusory contentment, illusory experience, which again may very well become a vehicle of adjustment rather than the opposite.
But isn't the ability, in a certain sense, to take drugs which can expand your personal individual consciousness to their greatest extent, if in fact this is what they do, or to work in art forms which expands one's own feelings and emotions to the utmost, isn't this really a kind of liberation and freedom which is unparalleled in history?
Well, maybe it is a liberation from things from which you shouldn't be liberated, because they are precisely the very essence of the present state of affairs, and if you liberate yourself artificially from it, what you actually do is not develop your consciousness, but arrest your consciousness.
In other words, this isn't so much a freedom to as a freedom from.
Exactly.
You talked of the misuse of the term revolution. Would you apply the same approbation to the use of the term in the context of the civil rights movement, the Negro Revolution, as well? Do you see this, in other words, as a sign, as a factor for change in the society of a significant sort?
Before you mention that, let me just point out that I think what possibly we're working toward is to see whether or not there are areas in which, or forces within the society which offer an opportunity for social change of some kind. Am I wrong, John?
No, yeah, that's right.
Yes, it is certainly, this movement certainly is a movement towards social change. I would not call it a revolution, because I personally cannot understand how you can call a revolution a movement which tries to implement the principles of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, the mere fact that we have to have such a movement today, almost 200 years after the Declaration of Independence, I think characterizes our society sufficiently. It is not a revolution, it is the effort to finally to translate into reality what was promised centuries ago, the promise with which actually modern society began and which is still not translated into reality.
C. Wright Mills dealt with two other groups within the society, namely the labor movement and the intellectuals. Would you apply the same criticism to both of these groups? Do you want to deal with them in turn?
I did not apply any criticism, as far as I remember, to the civil rights movement and to the Negro movement. As far as the labor movement...
No, I didn't mean criticism in that sense, but an estimate of the
Yes, as far as the labor movement is concerned, all I can say is that at present, organized labor in the United States, and not only in the United States, has nothing to do anymore with what Marx once called the proletariat and the developing consciousness and the revolutionary potential of the proletariat. Organized labor has today become one of the countervailing powers, cooperating with its countervailing power in the strengthening and improvement of the powers that be. Again, I certainly do not say that in any way as a kind of accusation or indictment, only in order to characterize the difference between the present state of affairs and in Europe's 19th century and in this country the 30s.
Would a class analysis of this society still have any meaning given the widespread affluence and the repression of any significant consciousness of problems within the society?
I can't help it, but I do believe that we still have a class society. A class society is not characterized by the increasing higher standard of living of the ruled classes, but is characterized, today most outspokenly characterized, by the fact that we have one group or class which, by virtue of its position in the social and economic process, decides and determines the fate of the entire population, and that the majority of the population, again by virtue of their position in the social and economic process, is really not in any way self-determinating.
In speaking of classes, let me first bring up something else. When you speak of social change and how it takes place, and I'll quote here, you say, first, which we've already said, the choice is primarily, but only primarily, the privilege of those groups which have attained control over the productive processes. Their control projects the way of life for the whole, and the ensuing and enslaving necessity is the result of their freedom. Then you say, and the possible abolition of this necessity depends on a new ingression of freedom, not any freedom, but that of men who comprehend the given necessity as insufferable pain and as unnecessary. So that here you set up as your criteria of social change a group which is, I would say from this, almost totally excluded from benefits of the society. And you make this clear, as you said earlier, in terms of labor movement, and you also make it clear when you speak of the people in general and their ability to change the situation, where you argue that in the redistribution of wealth and the equalization of classes, there is simply a new stratification characteristic of advanced industrial society and not any basic chance to change that method of stratification and stratification. But then you close your book, and this is only the last half page out of 257, it's true, when you say, however, underneath the conservative popular base is the substratum of the outcasts and outsiders, the exploited and persecuted of other races and colors, the unemployed and unemployable. They exist outside the democratic process. Their life is the most immediate and the most real need for ending intolerable conditions and institutions. Thus, their opposition is revolutionary, even if their consciousness is not. The fact that they start refusing to play the game may be the fact which marks the beginning of the end of the period. Now, is the fact that you spend only a half page in this in any sense characteristic of your evaluation of the possibility of this tendency?
Only partly characteristic. The other part is that, as I say, only the beginnings, it may mark the beginnings, these groups still are too powerless to accomplish the change by themselves. But I would like to add here that if I speak of the ingression of a new freedom motivated by the awareness of intolerable conditions, that does not necessarily and exclusively mean abject poverty and misery. I, for example, can very well envisage conditions under which social groups which are not poor, which are not which do not live in misery, become aware of the insanity of a society in which they have to continue, alienated labor, continue performances which they actually hate, continue the struggle for existence which has become more and more a rat race in the face of the possible abolition of all these. And that this awareness may well spread and become one of those potentially changing forces.
There currently are a number of programs taking place throughout the country, and of course the one that has gotten the most press recently is the Appalachian program for Appalachia. But also here in New York City and elsewhere in Oakland, California, there have been a number of programs in which an enormous amount of money is being spent in extremely small locations in an attempt to take this particular group of the population and somehow integrate them into the society. And I'm thinking of a project like the one going on in Harlem, in which $80 million is going to be invested, or one on the Lower East Side, which I believe has been allocated $120 million. And as I understand it, much of this money has come from an extremely sophisticated area of the leadership of the nation. Do you think that these kinds of programs, or any kind of program, will be able to reduce the number of those who are unemployed and unemployable? In other words, which way do you see this tendency going? Do you see this potentially revolutionary group increasing or decreasing?
That is very hard to say, because it depends entirely on the national and international situation. As to the project you mentioned, naturally, any and every project that reduces, even in a small area, misery and poverty and dirt is good and should be supported, but without illusions that they do not have the key for the decisive change seems to me clear, because this is not a local affair, but an affair that not only concerns the nation as a whole, but a supranational concern.
John?
No, I have nothing.
Well, let me ask one final question then. What do you see, and I think in a sense you've answered this, what do you see the role of scholars and intellectuals to be, given this particular state of society, where there doesn't seem to be, at least if your analysis is correct, much concrete action that can be done at this point, and indeed I'd say your analysis is a rather pessimistic one.
Yes, it is a pessimistic one, and precisely in this situation the intellectual, the scholar, perhaps has a more responsible role than he ever had before, because it is his task today, against all apparent or real success, to preserve, or rather to develop, those concepts, those ideas, those aspirations which do not succumb to the real or seeming benefits of a repressive society, but which concepts and modes of thought which remain loyal to the century-old hopes and aspirations of mankind for a society in which the struggle for existence is indeed pacified. This is today more than ever before a real possibility. And the entire power and the entire wealth of our society is at present directed against this possibility, precisely because it is so real. So in this situation, the scholar and the intellectual has one of the most decisive tasks.
Thank you very much. We've been talking to Dr. Herbert Marcuse, professor of philosophy at Brandeis University and author of a recent book, One-Dimensional Man, published by Beacon Press, and John Simon, an editor of a New York publishing house.